All right, you're live.
Thanks so much. All right, good evening, everyone. This is Katie Crystal speaking, Chair of the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission. I'm here with the Executive Committee of NVTC. Good evening and welcome to our September 3rd Executive Committee meeting. We are beginning at 5:35 p.m. So given the ongoing public health emergency, we will be conducting this meeting of exec as well as the General Commission electronically. Please let it be noted that the NVT staff followed the procedures and guidelines in the legislation enabling a virtual meeting to adequately give notice to the commission, to staff, and the public. And this meeting is simultaneously being broadcast to the public on YouTube. I think everyone has the hang of WebEx by now, and know that you have been provided with a WebEx cheat sheet for this committee meeting as well as for the General Commission meeting should you need more information. As always, if you could mute your microphone when you're not speaking, helps us cut down on background noise. As a reminder, no public business may be conducted over the chat. So find to use that chat function if you're having technical difficulties, but any substance about the business before the commission needs to be conducted verbally. And I'm going to go ahead and forego the raise your hand process for the purposes of executive session. So we are going to have two votes. This executive session is also going to involve a closed session. So we're going to have to vote to go into and come out of that closed session. And so I will ask for seconds. And if you could just identify, motions and seconds. And if you could identify yourself when you're doing that, that helps our secretary get an accurate log of the meeting. So Kate, could you call roll for the members of exec and the other commissioners who are joining us this evening?
Absolutely. So Chair Crystal.
Here.
Oh, thank you. Mr. Aguirre?
Here.
Just checking. Ms. Filler-Corn? Don't think she's on yet. Mr. Letourneau? Mr. McKay?
I'm here.
Wonderful. Mr. Meyer?
I'm here.
Mr. Smedberg? Mr. Snyder?
Here. Can you hear me?
I can. And we do have a quorum. And we do have some other members joining us. So I'll just call out and just confirm that you're here. Ms. Bennett Parker?
Here.
Mr. Alcorn?
I'm here as well.
Ms. Mitchell?
Here.
And I just saw Mr. Letourneau join us. Mr. Letourneau? Hopefully well, I do see him in the screen. Hopefully we'll get a chance to hear him later. And then just for awareness, we do have some staff here. Obviously, I'm Kate Mattice, Executive Director. We have our Director of Finance Administration, Scott Calcourt. We have Legal Counsel, Steve McIsaac. Web and IT Manager, Melissa Walker is making sure that everything's working fine. Thank you, Melissa. And then also our Legislative Liaison, Amy Parent-Cyber. And so I'll turn it back to you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Ms. Mattice. Thanks for joining us to those additional staff and for members of the Commission and the Executive Committee. So one note of summary, approximately 150 years ago, we had our last in-person meeting. That also was our last Executive Committee meeting. So I think you all should have in front of you the meeting summary from March 5th Executive Committee, which was the last time we had a convening of this group. So I wanted to ask if anyone had any corrections or concerns about that Executive Committee summary from March 5th. Okay, seeing none, I'm going to move in just to briefly review our agenda for tonight. We do have a pretty busy agenda for our commission meeting. As I think most of you know or got a note from Kate about, we had planned on a briefing from the general manager of WMATA. He was pulled away. He's not going to be able to join us. He is going to be at our October 1st meeting. And in fact, I think that will prove to be more timely. WMATA is just embarking on some major budget discussions, so we'll have an opportunity to ask him questions with more specificity about how that process is unfolding. But both Paul Smedberg and Matt, who's since joined us, Letourneau, will be speaking to current issues at WMATA in remarks to the commission tonight. Notably, and this is perhaps especially salient for our Fairfax members, but really for anybody who cares about transportation in our region, tonight we'll be starting with a tribute to Joe Alexander, who was a 31-year member of NVTC, who passed away just this past weekend. He played a really significant role in establishing both WMATA and VRE, and so we'll be taking a second to honor that legacy. And then both the executive committee, as I mentioned, but also the full commission will be conducting closed sessions about the VRE CEO appointment. So Kate, do you want to say just a word or two to preview the rest of the agenda?
I'm happy to do so. In fact, we do have a legislative update that we're going to hear from both the Speaker and Senator Evan. And then you're going to get a little preview, but we are going to, both Scott and I are going to be going over a presentation on sort of the state of transit in Northern Virginia, including the finances. So we're going to do a preview of that in just a little bit. And then, of course, we always have our reports from our board members. And thank you, Paul and Matt, for joining us here in Executive Committee, as well as, of course, from Director Mitchell and the VRE Acting CEO. And then finally, we're going to have two presentations that are information items, one of which is going to be very important as we move into the fall, which is the commuter choice program update. We do have a number of decisions this fall. And then also we do have an overview of a technical tool that we've been using with a number of our jurisdictions that's called T-Best. So that's pretty much the overview for tonight's meeting.
Thanks, Kate. And as Kate mentioned, she and Scott are here to give us a preview of that state of transit service and, importantly, revenues. Before we do that, let me pause. Any questions, concerns about the agenda, things you wanted to make sure were on that agenda that you didn't hear, or otherwise? Okay, seeing none. So yeah, we have an opportunity to just get a couple highlights. I think this presentation is really something we've all been asking for, which is, to the extent anybody has a crystal ball or at least insights into how this pandemic is affecting transit service and is going to affect transit service, particularly with regard to revenues. I think this team that Kate and Scott head up have been doing some really excellent work to try to forecast that for us. So they're going to give us just a preview of this with a full presentation to be ahead for the commission. So Kate and Scott, back over to you.
Oh, thank you so much. And in fact, I'm going to give only just one or a handful of slides for later. Scott's actually going to do a little bit deeper dive on the financials. And one of the things I want to put out there for you right now is at any time, if you want to have some meetings, some follow-up meetings to really dive into the financials, because there's just a lot of moving parts there. And Scott is working very closely with DRPT and DMV and other places where those revenues are. So first of all, just to give you a little bit of overview. I don't think this is any surprise to anybody, but this is basically the ridership trends for transit in Northern Virginia. We just grouped them by Metro Rail, VRE, Metro Bus, and then all of our other system operators. And the thing is you're seeing actually the beginning of the year, like transit was actually on a little bit of an upward trajectory. But obviously mid-March, we all know everything changed. So what we're doing is we're modeling very, very closely the trends. But what I want you to notice here is that, again, while there's stay-at-home, high telework, and I'll talk about that in just a minute, it didn't actually affect all the transit systems equally. I think it's fair to say the VRE probably saw the biggest percentage loss in its ridership, closely followed behind Metro Rail. But Metro Bus and the other bus systems actually did not lose as many riders. And so obviously we are tracking this through July. I think as we go through to September and October and are able to get those numbers, I think it's going to mean a lot more, especially as we know there are changing work patterns going on in the DC region. So we did pull out, actually University of Maryland has an incredibly comprehensive data source from all around the country. And so what we did is we pulled in some of the work from home trends. And we basically just did a snapshot of 1 week through the entire pandemic. Obviously, the week of March 9th was that week when we were all working our regular jobs. And then we immediately dove in April. And so what we have here is the DC, this is statewide data, okay? So we cannot get the granular. But what you generally see is that if you look at DC, Virginia, and Maryland, is you are finding anywhere between a 35% up to 50% of folks are working from home. And so again, this is an area as we look, what's that trajectory looking like as we move forward? But of course, it's really important. We all recognize what this means. In Northern Virginia, about 66% of transit trips are commuter trips. And that's an important thing to keep in mind because that does a big driver. The other side of it though, is only 66% of transit trips are for commuting. So we also cannot forget that other part. So one of the things that we did want to get a sense of, and this is where our folks who really know the COG demand forecast models, and we actually presented this to the MAC just the other week. which is really talking about roadways, but there is a nexus to the transit services. And so what we found, if you look at this chart, if you had 60% of Northern Virginia workers were teleworking is the far left. And as you go to find less and less people teleworking, what it does is it affects the traffic levels on freeways and those collectors at a steeper, it's sort of a steeper slope. It's a greater impact on those than you find on the arterials. And so what you think is right now, we're in that spot of somewhere between sort of 35, 45%, just ballparking. You know, that's what we're seeing right now. And I think it's fair to say we're seeing less traffic. But as we move closer to back to the 10%, which has been the regional average, you'll see a greater pickup in what's going on these freeways and arterials than you will on local roads. So what does that mean for transit? What that means, and this again is pulling straight from modeling data, is that you do see, as people start going back to work, the places where it's going to make the biggest impact are on Metro Rail and VRE. That's where we're going to start seeing the pickup when people start going back to work. Now, I don't, again, no crystal ball how that's working out. But again, bus is very, very important. This is only about commute trips. It's one of those things. So when you think about sort of looking forward on transit in our region, people coming back to work, people moving, there's still a very important role for all of our transit services. For especially, and this is again, just about commuters. But telework does have an impact. But you know, as soon as you start tweaking that a little bit, it has a bigger impact in bringing back folks on Metro Rail and VRE. So that's just the teaser. What I want to do now is hand over to Scott, who's really going to give an overview of the revenue sources. And this is definitely a bigger, deeper dive here than we're doing for the commission, but I really wanted to make sure you guys found that. So Scott.
Yeah, thank you, Kate. Yeah, so NVTC has four main sources of revenue: the regional motor fuels tax, DRPT assistance, which is, of course, by far NVTC's largest revenue source, commuter choice I-66 and 395. And I'll also touch on the funding sources for our G&A budget and briefly cover two funding streams provided directly by DRPT to WMATA, which is the WMATA Capital Fund and the state PREA match. Next slide. Okay, so this chart shows the regional motor fuels tax collections by NVTC over the past 10 years. As you are probably aware, revenues must be used by the local jurisdictions to fund WMATA, with the exception of Loudoun, where it can be used for any transportation purpose. The tax was first levied in 1981 at the rate of 2% on retail sales. In January 2010, it was converted to a 2.1% distributor-based tax. It was a revenue neutral change with the additional 0.1% to account for the retail profit, which is no longer part of the tax base. Next slide. Effective 2019, a floor on the price of fuel was established to mirror the statewide gas tax protection that was put in place several years prior. The additional revenue from the floor does not go to NVTC, but instead is withheld by the Commonwealth as a funding source for the WMATA Capital Fund and the VRE CROC Fund. And then effective fiscal year 21, the WMATA Capital Fund withholding was increased by about $8 million to a fixed $22.2 million per year. So with that change, not only is the revenue from this gain from the floor directed to WMATA and VRE, but also some revenue that NVTC would have otherwise collected or received. Also effective fiscal year 21, the tax rate was converted from 2.1% sales tax to 7.6 cents per gallon excise tax, which is also a revenue neutral change. However, that change, the tax is now indexed for inflation. So this slide here shows the gross tax and net revenue received by NVTC in fiscal year 20 by month, plus the first 2 months of fiscal year 21. One can, of course, see the impact of COVID with the gross tax revenue dropping from 4.2 to 2.2 million from February to April, but climbing back some in May and June. And you can also see the impact on NVTC's net collections with the increase in that withholding for the WMATA Fund effective fiscal year 21, especially in the month of May. As gross revenue increased, NVTC's collections actually decreased. Next slide. So this chart shows the estimated fiscal year 21 gross and net gas tax collections. We're assuming the statewide projections can be applied to the regional tax. Since DMV, who's the agency that administers the tax, they don't prepare projections on regional taxes. So the gross revenue is projected to decrease about 12% from 52.5 million to 46.3 million. NVTC's collections would then decrease about 43% from 32.5 to 18.5 million. An important point is that the omnibus transportation funding bill, absent the impacts of COVID, of course, would have significantly increased the assistance directly to NVTC, even taking into account the additional fuels tax revenue that's directed to the WMATA fund. Next slide. Okay, so DRPT capital and operating assistance. NVTC, of course, receives capital and operating assistance for the NVTC local systems, except for Loudoun County, who receives it directly, and the jurisdiction share of WMATA funding requirements. It is then allocated among the jurisdictions by NVTC's subsidy allocation model, where it is then held in trust at NVTC and available for the jurisdiction's transit use. For fiscal year 21, DRPT's 6-year improvement program, which shows the funding for the upcoming year, is delayed due to COVID. However, the fiscal year 2020 SIP has been extended to provide operating assistance for the first quarter based on fiscal year 20 funding levels. We understand DRPT plans to provide similar assistance for the second quarter, subject to CTP approval. So pending the release of the SIP sometime in the fall, the fiscal year 21 planning purposes for NVTC, the fiscal year 20 operating assistance funding levels are assumed. Next slide. This table is from the Secretary of Finance August 18th presentation showing the forecasted revenues for the Commonwealth Transportation Fund, which is the fund source for DRPT's programs. For fiscal year 21, it shows a 400.8 million decrease between the official and these updated projections. And likewise, a 349 million decrease is projected in fiscal year 22. Okay, next slide. So for Commuter Choice Program I-66, NVTC receives revenue under a 40-year agreement with the Commonwealth. Revenue is net of cost of operating the facility. And then under an amended agreement effective fiscal year 21, NVTC is to receive a 10 million escalating annual payment subject to available toll revenues. And effective fiscal year 22, NVTC is to receive an additional 5 million escalating concessionaire payment for a total of 15 million annually. So quickly on this chart, fiscal year 17 is when NVTC received an initial payment for projects before tolling began. In fiscal year 18, tolling commenced in December 2017. Fiscal year 19 is the first full year of tolling. And in fiscal year 20, VDOT's budget had net toll revenues at 17.6 million to NVTC, which was later revised to 10.6 million during the third and fourth quarter. And that's ultimately what we received. In fiscal year 21, the MOA calls for a flat 10 million payment to NVTC. However, VDOT projects only 3.6 million will be available. And in fiscal year 22, as I mentioned, the MOA calls for a 15 million payment. At this point, we don't have any projections for what this might actually be. That's what I have for 66. Next slide.
There we go.
So the 395.95 program is a joint program with PRTC, which NVTC administers. The agreement calls for a $15 million escalating annual concessionaire payment. The first payment, which was received at the start of tolling late last fall, we expect to receive the second payment in the next few months. Next slide. So this is a slide about NVTC's general administrative budget. Just want to point out that the main source of revenue is from NVTC's jurisdictions, and they're received in two different ways. One is direct contributions from the jurisdictions, and the other way is revenue taken off the top of state aid as it's received by NVTC. Excuse me. Other revenue sources include commuter choice funding for the administrative and marketing of the program, some project grant revenue, interest, and carried over surplus. Next slide. So these last two slides are funding sources from DRPT directly to WMATA. This slide shows the DRPT WMATA Capital Fund sources and the pre-COVID fiscal year 21 revenue projections. DRPT provides payments from this fund to be the Commonwealth's dedicated commitment to WMATA. Virginia's share of that is $154.5 million, which is about 31% of the $500 million total. Maryland and DC, of course, make up the difference. Next slide. The final slide is the Commonwealth's required match to the federal PREA funding, which is provided by DRPT directly to WMATA. To date, and including in fiscal year 21, the funding has been from transportation bond revenue, which is now fully exhausted. Going forward, starting in fiscal year 22, the match will be off the top of the DRPT revenues. Okay, that's what I have. Let me know if you have any questions.
Well, thank you, Kate and Scott, for that grim but very well developed set of forecasts and thoughts, particularly on the financial side. Let me invite questions or comments. You'll have another bite at this apple and for a slightly longer version of this presentation, but obviously as the executive committee will be the ones to think first on issues like budget amendments and circumscribing programs. So I want to give everybody a chance to weigh in here or ask questions.
Hey, I've got a question.
Yeah, please jump in, Matt.
Remind me again, I'm glad we spent a lot of time on like the 66 MOA and that Long Bridge agreement because we did talk about minimums and things like that. But what exactly happens then in this 66 scenario when we were essentially guaranteed a certain amount in the MOA, the actual revenue is not going to materialize? Will the Commonwealth actually still provide that level of funding?
So I think we can ask Kate to weigh in, and at risk of putting Jennifer too much on the spot.
Yeah, I was thinking to myself, I'm putting Jennifer on the spot here, but.
Can I add on to that question too?
Sure, yeah. Please.
Yeah, I just want to add to, so what if, because part of it is that they have to meet their operating goals before they start giving us money. So what if they're not even meeting their operating goals? So then
it's a good finer point on that query.
So there's a couple of different dynamics at play. For I-66 inside the Beltway, that is a facility that's actually managed by VDOT. And so that sort of has one set of rules. When it comes to concessionaires, which are the I-395, which is transurban, and then outside the Beltway, which NVTC doesn't have a formal place in that other than we have an arrangement that some funds, that's then a different consortia. So in all instances, there's something that's called a waterfall chart. And that basically does, as Scott was mentioning, there's existing commitments and to basically pay and operate the facility. And then there are steps in the waterfall. For right now, we're close to number 1 or number 2 in that waterfall after the obligations. But we're obviously having Steve McIsaac look very closely at all of those and to see when there isn't literally enough net gross revenue, it does become difficult to find that net revenue. And I do not believe, and this is what we can go back, is that there is actually an ability for the Commonwealth to move money from somewhere else to add to that program. So the minimum guarantee is if and when there are revenues that are available above and beyond the operating assistance. Yeah. So I don't know, Jennifer,
that's been true. That's been true as long as we've been in this MOA, right? What changed with last year's updates was the waterfall, not the amount of money that would be available after the state met its operating obligations.
So the waterfall actually put a list of a target, I guess is the better way of saying it. There was actually no dollar value associated with the MOA amendments prior to that. The very first MOA had $5 million a year for NVTC. So, but what we were able to do was get a payout chart. Now, when it comes to 395, again, that's a longer facility. that has a greater chance of revenue recovery for Transurban. They have publicly said that they will be able to meet those commitments. We will find out more this fall as we're expected to get our next payment. So the 66 facility is fairly small. My understanding is that because it's such a limited facility, that it probably has a greater risk in terms of the level of revenue that we're able to receive.
Jennifer, did you want to add anything to that?
Sure. And I think Kate summed it up pretty well, that really this is the way the agreement works is it's this waterfall of buckets, if you would, of funds. And each bucket is filled up based on what's available. The agreement, I think, as I interpret it, and don't take this as an official interpretation, does not commit us to providing other sources, funds from other outside sources of revenues. The one thing I do want to just make you all very aware of for our funding picture overall, there is a budget amount. We are expecting obviously shortfalls in all of our revenue sources, and for the Transportation Trust Fund, and our Mass Transit Trust Fund is actually based on a percentage of the overall Transportation Trust Fund. We have submitted a budget amendment to, there's several budget amendments, but the one that's most relevant to us is that it gives DRPT the flexibility to move money out of our statewide transit capital fund and our what's called a new transit ridership incentive program that was created in the omnibus bill, so that we can meet our obligations to NVTC for WMATA, and also so we can meet our obligations for statewide operating assistance. We're still working through exactly what that looks like and what our balances are. I can tell you that we are going to be taking we are probably going to have very little of a statewide capital fund at all this year, because so that we can meet our NVTC commitments, and as well as our, some of our statewide operating as well. We will probably be focusing our statewide operating assistance on the Northern Virginia urban systems, such as Fairfax, such as all of your local systems, because we also realize you don't have the CARES Act funding to tap into. So as innocent, I would not say this in another forum at least, but with you all at least, we may end up utilizing revenues that would otherwise go to other parts of the state so that we can help you all meet our commitment to WMATA. We're still working through what we can do with our WMATA Capital Fund. The budget amendment doesn't actually allow us to move money into the WMATA Capital Fund. That's something that we have to work through a little bit further to figure out what we do if there's a shortfall there. So I just I wanted to paint the picture for you all that, we expect that we're going to have a very, very difficult year in meeting our commitments statewide, but especially to WMATA. And so that's going to be our first priority, is making sure that we can get our the funding that we provide to WMATA every year for operating and capital. That we provide to NVTC every year for your match to WMATA. That's going to be our top priority.
Okay. Thank you. Last piece at least is heartening. Matt, did you want to follow up on the
well, just
MOAs?
I'm sure it's premature to ask the question, but I will anyway. Specific on the capital budget, has there been any discussion about Long Bridge and how all of this may impact that schedule? Because obviously if the Commonwealth isn't proceeding on the same schedule, that could potentially free up some revenue if it ever appears for this program.
We are still planning to move forward with Long Bridge on the schedule that we have. We're still evaluating the impacts of our of COVID on our financial plan. I believe we were expecting that we would be issuing debt on the 66 toll revenues, I believe in 21, 22. We're now expecting that, just given the state of toll revenues, that we're going to have to push that back a year or two at least. However, we do still really need those revenues to begin construction. But we are at this point still moving forward and trying to complete the project in the same time frame.
Matt, we were just talking at the before we went live that the Long Bridge project actually just completed the environmental assessment today, so it is continuing to move forward.
Yeah, I mean, it's good, but I'm just thinking about, ways that we can handle it. And I appreciate, Jennifer, the comment. I mean, we've been asked the question at WMATA, Paul and I, basically by management and by the chair of the finance committee, is everybody going to be able to make their payments that's committed to it, whether that's local jurisdictions or states or otherwise. Maryland is having concerns and questions about some of these issues. I think it's fair to say we have not reported that Virginia would not be making its payments in any bucket at this point. So certainly if it becomes clear to you at some point that may happen, we would need to know as soon as possible, but we're not assuming that.
I can say if we don't get this budget amendment passed, we are not going to be able to meet our commitments to you all for Metro. So I've talked with Kate about this.
How is your handicapping on the budget amendment?
Yeah, and what's the timeline for that, Jennifer? Do you know?
We're probably better off asking the speaker about that
The
later.
speaker's on? Oh, okay.
Yeah, but it's I will say that at this point we haven't heard any specific concerns about it. However, we also don't want to assume that it's a gimme, and so we would certainly welcome all of your support. And it's also, and probably Amy as well, have been helping out in some outreach to legislators. But that is absolutely essential in order to meet our commitments. WMATA Capital Fund, still trying to work through what we can do there if there is a shortfall within the constraints of the legislation. And we recognize as well that if there is a shortfall from Virginia, it could potentially cause DC and Maryland to reduce the amount that they have to put in. But, we're not at that point yet. We believe we have some options available, but we need to make sure that we can do it under the current legislation and under the budget amendments.
Madam Chair, could I just ask a quick question? Jennifer and Matt, and you may want to clarify this as well. Jennifer, are we talking just the remainder of 21, or are you focusing mainly on 22 with some of these comments?
Really focusing on the remainder of 21 right now.
Okay.
But if things continue, we may have similar issues in 22.
Right. And just one point of information with the legislation. In effect, does it give you some flexibility to? Is that what you're seeking? I guess is that a fair statement?
Yeah, it's seeking flexibility, and there was actually a budget amendment that the governor had put into the budget that gave the CTB extremely broad latitude to move funds around. That budget amendment was actually voted down by the General Assembly, including, I'll say, one or two members that are on NVTC. So the way that the current budget amendment is written, it's very tailored to say DRPT can move money from these two programs into the NVTC fund and then also to statewide transit operating. So it doesn't give us broad enough latitude to just move stuff around anyway.
And are they current members of NVTC or former?
We're going to talk about it later.
Okay.
As a reminder to everyone, we are being broadcast right now on YouTube. So.
Okay.
All right. Other questions about the forecast? As a reminder, this is going to be presented in greater depth at the session we're about to begin with our full commission colleagues at 7. So there's an opportunity for discussion there too. Okay. Seeing none, I'm gonna, in the interest of keeping us on time, I'm gonna spare you all the upcoming activities, but just note that we do have our joint briefing scheduled, which is always something we look forward to in December. We are prepared at this point to make the call that should be virtual rather than holding a hotel reservation that will likely go unused. So the team, unless there are any objections, is going to go ahead and begin to prepare for what we hope will be a well-attended and as lively as possible in a virtual format, briefing. Okay, so we are going to go ahead and move into closed session. This is an opportunity for the executive committee to discuss a personnel matter regarding an appointment at VRE and to preview a conversation that we'll be having in closed session with the entire commission later tonight. For those who may be listening and watching on YouTube, we plan to return to open session. So the YouTube feed is going to continue with a screen noting that we're in closed session, and the meeting is going to resume live once we've returned to open session. So if you have any technical difficulties, do go ahead and check that YouTube channel for a new feed. Commissioners, executive committee, if you could stay on this WebEx link. Our legal counsel, Steve McIsaac, is going to stay with us in the closed session, and the rest of the NVTC staff are going to be put in a WebEx lobby to wait for us to return to open session. So I'm going to go ahead and make a motion to go into closed session, which is that pursuant to the Virginia Freedom of Information Act, Section 2.2, 3711A.1 of the Code of Virginia, the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission's Executive Committee moves to convene a closed session to discuss a personnel matter concerning the appointment of the Virginia Railway Express Chief Executive Officer. Do I have a second?
Second.
Great. Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, Ms. Matthijs is going to call the roll for a vote.
Chair Crystal,
Yes.
Mr. Aguirre,
Yes.
Phyllis Horn.
Yes.
Mr. Letourneau,
Aye.
Mr. McKay,
Aye.
Mr. Meyer,
Yes.
Mr. Smedberg,
Aye.
Mr. Snyder. I think you may be mute right now. Mr. Snyder? Would you like to? Thank you.
Hit *6 on my phone. Thanks.
Thank you. The motion passes.
Yeah.
And I'll turn it back over to the chair.
Great. Thank you so much, Ms. Matthijs. So we're going to give just a minute for our staff to move into that lobby. Okay. I suppose somebody can't tell us when they're not here anymore, so I think
I'm still on, so I'll see. If we need to dial out, we can dial back in too, as long as we know when to do that.
All right, I'm still seeing NVTC staff.
Yes, I'm going to stay on. Kate, can you make yourself not a presenter anymore? It won't let me take the ball.
Absolutely.
Great.
Sorry
Okay,
about that.
thanks. So Melissa, you'll have it just sort of quietly in the background, right? And we'll text you when
I
we're
will
ready.
give you the go ahead in just a second as soon as Kate gives me the ball.
You should have the ball.
You have to right click.
I thought I already did.
Oh, maybe I can expel you.
That's fine.
You want me to expel you? I can.
That's just fine. You can do that.
Okay, I'm expelling you. And then I'm going to go make sure everyone else is gone, and then I will stop the stream. Goodbye. Yes, goodbye, Kate Matthijs. All right. I'm almost there, you guys.
Discussed or considered. Do I have a second?
Second.
Great. I'm going to go with Mr. Meyer for the second. Thank you. All right. Ms. Dice will call the roll for us. Oh, I'm sorry. Actually, since I think we had some trouble getting her on, Melissa, I wonder if you might be able to call the roll for us if you have the.
I don't know if I have the authority, but I would be happy to do so.
Okay, that would be great.
Okay, let's start with Ms. Crystal,
Yes.
Mr. Mr. Smedberg,
Aye.
Billercorn,
Aye.
Mr. Garrett,
Aye.
Mr. Meyer,
Aye.
Ms. Mitchell,
I'm here, but I don't think I vote.
you're right, you don't. Mr. Letourneau,
Aye.
One of these.
Ms. Bennett Parker, and Mr. McKay,
Aye.
and Mr. Snyder.
Yes.
I think that's everyone, guys.
All right. Thank you so much for pinch hitting, Melissa. So that
Sorry about that.
concludes our executive session. So as a reminder, we'll be starting again promptly at 7, giving everybody 25 minutes to nab some dinner. We will be on a different WebEx link. That's a different WebEx link. So if you can find that in the email that was sent to you. But if you don't have that handy, please do email Kate to make sure that you've got it. We will not be meeting back on this link. So you may want to consider going ahead and getting logged into that commission meeting to make sure you don't have technical difficulties. And we are going to try to resume at 7 p.m. again. So unless there are objections, I'm going to adjourn the meeting and I'll see you all at 7 p.m. for our next. Thanks.